A final tour of England left him exhausted and ill, and the death of his sister, Fanny, on the 14th of May, 1847, caused him further distress. Less than 6 months later, on the 4th of November, aged 38, Mendelssohn died in Leipzig after a series of strokes. His grandfather Moses, Fanny, and both his parents had all died from similar apoplexies. Felix's funeral was held at the Paulinerkirche, Leipzig, and he was buried at the Dreifaltig Kiez-Friedhof in Berlin-Kreuzberg. The pallbearers included Moscheles, Schumann, and Niels Gade. Mendelssohn had once described death, in a letter to a stranger, as a place where it is to be hoped there is still music, but no more sorrow or partings. Personal life. Personality. While Mendelssohn was often presented as equable, happy, and placid in temperament, particularly in the detailed family memoirs published by his nephew Sebastian Hensel after the composer's death, this was misleading. The music historian R. Larry Todd notes the remarkable process of idealization of Mendelssohn's character that crystallized in the memoirs of the composer's circle, including Hensel's. The nickname Discontented Polish Count was given to Mendelssohn on account of his aloofness, and he referred to the epithet in his letters. He was frequently given to fits of temper, which occasionally led to collapse. Devrient mentions that on one occasion in the 1830s, when his wishes had been crossed, his excitement was increased so fearfully that when the family was assembled, he began to talk incoherently in English. The stern voice of his father at last checked the wild torrent of words. They took him to bed, and a profound sleep of 12 hours restored him to his normal state. Such fits may be related to his early death. Mendelssohn was an enthusiastic visual artist who worked in pencil and watercolor, a skill which he enjoyed throughout his life. His correspondences indicate that he could write with considerable wit in German and English. These letters are sometimes accompanied by humorous sketches and cartoons. Religion. On the 21st of March, 1816, at the age of 7 years, Mendelssohn was baptized with his brother and sisters in a home ceremony by Johann Jakob Stedman, minister of the Evangelical Congregation of Berlin's Jerusalem Church and New Church. Although Mendelssohn was a conforming Christian as a member of the Reformed Church, he was both conscious and proud of his Jewish ancestry and notably of his connection with his grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn. He was the prime mover in proposing to the publisher Heinrich Brockhaus a complete edition of Moses's works, which continued with the support of his uncle, Joseph Mendelssohn. Felix was notably reluctant, either in his letters or conversation, to comment on his innermost beliefs. His friend Devrient wrote that deep convictions were never uttered in intercourse with the world, only in rare and intimate moments did they ever appear, and then only in the slightest and most humorous allusions. Thus, for example, in a letter to his sister Rebecca, Mendelssohn rebukes her complaint about an unpleasant relative. "What do you mean by saying you are not hostile to Jews? I hope this was a joke. It is really sweet of you that you do not despise your family, isn't it?" Some modern scholars have devoted considerable energy to demonstrate either that Mendelssohn was deeply sympathetic to his ancestors' Jewish beliefs, or that he was hostile to this and sincere in his Christian beliefs. Mendelssohn and his contemporaries. Throughout his life, Mendelssohn was wary of the more radical musical developments undertaken by some of his contemporaries. He was generally on friendly, if sometimes somewhat cool, terms with Hector Berlioz, Franz Liszt, and Giacomo Meyerbeer, but in his letters expresses his frank disapproval of their works, for example writing of Liszt that his compositions were inferior to his playing, and only calculated for virtuosos, of Berlioz's overture Les Francs-Jugs that one ought to wash one's hands after handling one of his scores. And of Meyerbeer's opera Robert le Diable, I consider it ignoble, calling its villain Bertram a poor devil. When his friend the composer Ferdinand Hiller suggested in conversation to Mendelssohn that he looked rather like Meyerbeer, they were actually distant cousins, both descendants of Rabbi Moses Isserles. Mendelssohn was so upset that he immediately went to get a haircut to differentiate himself. In particular, Mendelssohn seems to have regarded Paris and its music with the greatest of suspicion and an almost puritanical distaste. Attempts made during his visit there to interest him in Saint-Simonianism ended in embarrassing scenes. It is significant that the only musician with whom Mendelssohn remained a close personal friend, Ignaz Moscheles, was of an older generation and equally conservative in outlook. Moscheles preserved this conservative attitude at the Leipzig Conservatory until his own death in 1870. Marriage and children. Mendelssohn married Cécile Charlotte Sophie Jean Renaud the 10th of October, 1817 to the 25th of September, 1853, the daughter of a French Reformed Church clergyman, on the 28th of March, 1837. The couple had 5 children: Karl, Marie, Paul, Lily, and Felix August. The second youngest child, Felix August, contracted measles in 1844 and was left with impaired health. He died in 1851. The eldest, Carl Mendelssohn Bartholdy, the 7th of February, 1838 to the 23rd of February, 1897, became a historian and professor of history at Heidelberg and Freiburg universities. He died in a psychiatric institution in Freiburg aged 59. Paul Mendelssohn Bartholdy (1841 to 1880) was a noted chemist and pioneered the manufacture of aniline dye. Marie married Victor Beneck and lived in London. Lily married Adolf Wock, later professor of law at Leipzig University. The family papers inherited by Marie's and Lily's children form the basis of the extensive collection of Mendelssohn manuscripts, including the so-called Green Books of his correspondence, now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. Cécile Mendelssohn Bartholdy died less than 6 years after her husband, on the 25th of September, 1853. Jenny Lind. Mendelssohn became close to the Swedish soprano Jenny Lind, whom he met in October 1844. Papers confirming their relationship had not been made public. In 2013, George Biddlecombe confirmed in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association that the committee of the Mendelssohn Scholarship Foundation possesses material indicating that Mendelssohn wrote passionate love letters to Jenny Lind entreating her to join him in an adulterous relationship and threatening suicide as a means of exerting pressure upon her, and that these letters were destroyed on being discovered after her death. Mendelssohn met and worked with Lind many times, and started an opera, Lorelei, for her, based on the legend of the Lorelei Rhine maidens. The opera was unfinished at his death. He is said to have tailored the aria Hear Ye Israel, in his oratorio Elijah, to Lind's voice, although she did not sing the part until after his death, at a concert in December 1848. In 1847, Mendelssohn attended a London performance of Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable, an opera that musically he despised, in order to hear Lind's British debut, in the role of Alice. The music critic Henry Chorley, who was with him, wrote, "I see as I write the smile with which Mendelssohn, whose enjoyment of MDLEM. Lind's talent was unlimited, turned round and looked at me, as if a load of anxiety had been taken off his mind." His attachment to MDLEM. Lind's genius as a singer was unbounded, as was his desire for her success. Upon Mendelssohn's death, Lind wrote, "The only person who brought fulfillment to my spirit, and almost as soon as I found him I lost him again." In 1849, she established the Mendelssohn Scholarship Foundation, which makes an award to a young resident British composer every 2 years in Mendelssohn's memory. The first winner of the scholarship, in 1856, was Arthur Sullivan, then aged 14. In 1869, Lind erected a plaque in Mendelssohn's memory at his birthplace in Hamburg. Music. Composer. Style. Something of Mendelssohn's intense attachment to his personal vision of music is conveyed in his comments to a correspondent who suggested converting some of the songs without words into Lieder by adding texts. "What music I love expresses to me are not thoughts that are too indefinite for me to put into words, but on the contrary, too definite." Schumann wrote of Mendelssohn that he was the Mozart of the 19th century, the most brilliant musician, the one who most clearly sees through the contradictions of the age and for the first time reconciles them. This appreciation brings to the fore 2 features that characterized Mendelssohn's compositions and his compositional process. First, that his inspiration for musical style was rooted in his technical mastery and his interpretation of the style of previous masters, although he certainly recognized and developed the strains of early Romanticism in the music of Beethoven and Weber. The historian James Garrett writes that from his early career, the view emerged that Mendelssohn's engagement with early music was a defining aspect of his creativity. This approach was recognized by Mendelssohn himself, who wrote that, in his meetings with Goethe, he gave the poet historical exhibitions at the keyboard every morning. For about an hour, I have to play a variety of works by great composers in chronological order, and must explain to him how they contributed to the advance of music. Secondly, it highlights that Mendelssohn was more concerned to reinvigorate the musical legacy which he inherited, rather than to replace it with new forms and styles, or with the use of more exotic orchestration. In these ways he differed significantly from many of his contemporaries in the early Romantic period, such as Wagner, Berlioz, and Franz Liszt. Whilst Mendelssohn admired Liszt's virtuosity at the keyboard, he found his music jejune. Berlioz said of Mendelssohn that he had perhaps studied the music of the dead too closely. The musicologist Greg Vitasek considers that, while Mendelssohn's music only rarely aspires to provoke, the stylistic innovations evident from his earliest work solve some of the contradictions between classical forms and the sentiments of Romanticism. The expressiveness of Romantic music presented a problem in adherence to sonata form. The final recapitulation section of a movement could seem, in the context of Romantic style, a bland element without passion or soul. Furthermore, it could be seen as a pedantic delay before reaching the emotional climax of a movement, which in the classical tradition had tended to be at the transition from the development section of the movement to the recapitulation, whereas Berlioz and other modernists sought to have the emotional climax at the end of a movement, if necessary by adding an extended coda to follow the recapitulation proper. Mendelssohn's solution to this problem was less sensational than Berlioz's approach, but was rooted in changing the structural balance of the formal components of the movement. Thus typically in a Mendelssohnian movement, the development-recapitulation transition might not be strongly marked, and the recapitulation section would be harmonically or melodically varied so as not to be a direct copy of the opening, exposition, section. This allowed a logical movement towards a final climax. Vitasek summarizes the effect as to assimilate the dynamic trajectory of an external form to the logical unfolding of the story of the theme. Richard Taraskin writes that, although Mendelssohn produced works of extraordinary mastery at a very early age, he never outgrew his precocious youthful style. He remained stylistically conservative, feeling no need to attract attention with a display of revolutionary novelty. Throughout his short career he remained comfortably faithful to the musical status quo, that is, that are classical forms, as they were already thought of by his time. His version of Romanticism, already evident in his earliest works, consisted in musical pictorialism of a fairly conventional, objective nature, though exquisitely wrought. Early works. The young Mendelssohn was greatly influenced in his childhood by the music of both J. S. Bach and C. P. E. R. Bach, and of Beethoven, Joseph Haydn, and Mozart. Traces of these composers can be seen in the 12 early string symphonies. These were written from 1821 to 1823, when he was between the ages of 12 and 14, principally for performance in the Mendelssohn household, and not published or publicly performed until long after his death. His first published works were his 3 piano quartets 1822 to 1825, Op. 1 in C minor, Op. 2 in F minor, and Op. 3 in B minor, but his capacities are especially revealed in a group of works of his early maturity, the String Octet 1825, the Overture A Midsummer Night's Dream 1826, which in its finished form also owes much to the influence of Adolf Bernhard Marx, at the time a close friend of Mendelssohn, and the 2 early string quartets, Op. 12 1829 and Op. 13 1827, which both show a remarkable grasp of the techniques and ideas of Beethoven's last quartets that Mendelssohn had been closely studying. These 4 works show an intuitive command of form, harmony, counterpoint, color, and compositional technique, which in the opinion of R. Larry Todd justifies claims frequently made that Mendelssohn's precocity exceeded even that of Mozart in its intellectual grasp. A 2009 survey by the BBC of 16 music critics opined that Mendelssohn was the greatest composing prodigy in the history of Western classical music. Symphonies. Mendelssohn's mature symphonies are numbered approximately in the order of publication, rather than the order in which they were composed. The order of composition is 1, 5, 4, 2, 3. The placement of number 3 in this sequence is problematic because he worked on it for over a decade, starting the sketches soon after he began work on number 5, but completing it after both numbers 5 and 4. The Symphony No. 1 in C minor for full orchestra was written in 1824, when Mendelssohn was aged 15. This work is experimental, showing the influences of Beethoven and Carl Maria von Weber. Mendelssohn conducted the symphony on his first visit to London in 1829, with the orchestra of the Philharmonic Society. For the 3rd movement he substituted an orchestration of the scherzo from his octet. In this form the piece was a success, and laid the foundations of his British reputation. During 1829 and 1830 Mendelssohn wrote his Symphony No. 5, known as the Reformation. It celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Reformation. Mendelssohn remained dissatisfied with the work and did not allow publication of the score. Mendelssohn's travels in Italy inspired him to compose the Symphony No. 4 in A major, known as the Italian Symphony. He conducted the premiere in 1833, but did not allow the score to be published during his lifetime, as he continually sought to rewrite it. The Scottish Symphony Symphony No. 3 in A minor was written and revised intermittently between 1829, when Mendelssohn noted down the opening theme during a visit to Holyrood Palace, and 1842, when it was given its premiere in Leipzig, the last of his symphonies to be premiered in public. This piece evokes Scotland's atmosphere in the ethos of Romanticism, but does not employ any identified Scottish folk melodies. He wrote the symphony cantata Lobgesang Hymn of Praise in B-flat major, posthumously named Symphony No. 2, to mark the celebrations in Leipzig of the supposed 400th anniversary of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg. The first performance took place on the 25th of June, 1840. Other orchestral music. Mendelssohn wrote the concert overture The Hebrides Fingal's Cave in 1830, inspired by visits to Scotland around the end of the 1820s. He visited Fingal's Cave, on the Hebridean Isle of Staffa, as part of his grand tour of Europe, and was so impressed that he scribbled the opening theme of the overture on the spot, including it in a letter he wrote home the same evening. He wrote other concert overtures, notably Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage Mira Still and Glucklich Fahrt, 1828, inspired by a pair of poems by Goethe, and the Fair Melusine die Skone Melusine, 1830. A contemporary writer considered these works as perhaps the most beautiful overtures that, so far, we Germans possess. Mendelssohn also wrote in 1839 an overture to Ruy Blos, commissioned for a charity performance of Victor Hugo's drama, which the composer hated. His incidental music to A Midsummer Night's Dream Op. 61, including the well-known Wedding March, was written in 1843, 17 years after the overture. Concertos. The Violin Concerto in E minor, Op. 60 for 1844, was written for Ferdinand David. David, who had worked closely with Mendelssohn during the piece's preparation, gave the premiere of the concerto on his Guarneri violin. Joseph Joachim called it one of the 4 great violin concertos, along with those of Beethoven, Brahms, and Bruch. Mendelssohn also wrote a lesser-known, early concerto for violin and strings in D minor, 1822, for piano concertos A No. 0, in A minor, 1822, 1 in G minor, 1831, 2 in D minor, 1837, and 3 in E minor, a posthumously published fragment from 1844, 2 concertos for 2 pianos and orchestra E major, which he wrote at 14, an A-flat major, at 15, and another double concerto, for violin and piano 1823. In addition, there are several single-movement works for soloist and orchestra. Those for piano are the Rondo Brillanti of 1834, the Capriccio Brillanti of 1832, and the Serenade and Allegro Giocoso of 1838. He also wrote 2 concertinos Concertstück, Op. 113 and 114, originally for clarinet, basset horn, and piano. Op. 113 was orchestrated by the composer. Chamber music.